Hello, and thanks for joining us today for this IT Pro TV webinar. We will be live tweeting during the webinar at #ProsKnow. Have a question? Use the GoToWebinar question box throughout the webinar, and we will answer as many as we can at the end. You will receive a link to a recording of the webinar delivered to your inbox. Questions not answered during the webinar will be answered on Twitter with the #ProsKnow. Now let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the IT Pro TV webinar series. Today's topic, when disaster strikes. That disaster planning, you know you need it, but you've been putting it off. Maybe you didn't know where to start. We're here to help you with that. I'm your host, Mike Roderick, and I've been teaching here at IT Pro TV for about 5 years, been in the IT training for about 15 years, certifications from various vendors, Microsoft, CompTIA, EC Council, and I'm joined here by Mr. Don Pizzette, who is also an edutainer here at IT Pro TV, as well as being one of the co-founders of IT Pro TV, and he's certified in just about everything that you can get. And worked here at IT Pro TV. And you know, what is IT Pro TV? Well, IT Pro TV is binge-worthy learning for IT pros. We've got something for everybody, whether you're just getting started in IT or whether you've been doing it for a while. We've got courses that are get you into the door, basic courses, and we've got advanced courses where you can learn the more complex topics. All right, Don, so what do you say we get started with today's topic, when disaster strikes?
All right, so when disaster strikes, it sounds so ominous and negative and all that, but really disasters are things that we just kind of have to account for and plan for and know that they're going to happen. They're things that we can't stop. So for this webinar, I want to take a nice approach to this because a lot of times when we talk about disaster planning, we're talking about paperwork and bureaucracy. So I want to step away from that and say instead, what are some of the key things we should be doing in our organization to make sure that we're prepared for disasters and that our company can continue operations during and after an event of a significant proportion. Now, when I say an event of significant proportion, what the heck am I talking about? So let's start with a real quick base definition of what is a disaster. Now, Mike, I'll put you on the spot here. When I say like an IT company has a disaster, what's the first thing that pops to your mind?
Usually like natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, things like that.
All right, that's what I think of as well. You know, we're in Florida, right? So we're coming at you live from Gainesville, Florida. And in Florida, we have these little things called hurricanes. And it's not just Florida, several states have this, but this is our primary disaster that happens around here. It is a massive windstorm, usually accompanied by flooding. And these can take out power lines, can take out data lines, can flood data centers, can really wreak all sorts of havoc on a physical level. So many people create plans for what to do when a hurricane comes in. But in today's world, we have all new cool disasters that vary regionally and from country to country. So you need to make sure you understand the types of disasters you're up against. For example, rioting. Most of us don't think about riots as an IT disaster, but there have been numerous riots right here in the United States, accompanied with looting, cutting of power lines, things of a very aggressive nature, very similar to terrorism, right? Terrorist attacks also create a disaster, and there's numerous stories of that occurring. There are earthquakes. Now, we don't have earthquakes here in Florida, so we're kind of fortunate, but you know, every location kind of has their own disasters they have to worry about. If you have a data center in California, earthquakes are very much on your mind. I mean, there were earthquakes just last week, right? And so that's got to be a part of your preparation. But it can be other things like power grid failure, right? There's a number of utilities companies that are under attack from foreign nation states, state-sponsored organizations that are trying to hack into the power grid and shut it down. And the main one that's been kind of on everybody's radar this year is something that most of us don't even think about when we think of disasters, and that's ransomware. If you walk into your company one day and all of the machines are displaying a screen like this, send us $5,000 worth of Bitcoin or you don't get your data back, that's a disaster. It's the equivalent of your building being destroyed because you have no computers available anymore. So these are all things that we need to plan for. We need to have processes in place. And this is the capital P process, right? The one that equals paperwork. And it's just a plan, right? So that we're not caught unawares, that it's not a surprise, that it's a last minute thing. Oh, we got to figure out what to do. We know what to do and we can go and take those steps. That's the big thing about disaster planning. Now, when companies approach a disaster recovery plan, there's two different types of plans you'll hear about out there. So there's disaster recovery planning, or DRP, And then there's business resumption planning, or BRP, right? Some people call it BCP, business continuity planning. So it's the same thing. So the terminology gets a little bit confusing. So let's talk about that briefly. Disaster recovery is kind of what I'm focusing on here, which means that your organization has a catastrophic failure. Maybe the loss of your headquarters, the loss of all of your computers, the loss of all of your employees, something of that nature. All right. So your company is no longer at 100% functionality. You might be at 5% functionality. You might be at 0% functionality, right? Disaster recovery is, how do you get back to 100%? How do we get back to as if the disaster had never occurred? And that takes a lot of work, depending on the level of a disaster that we're talking about, right? Business resumption, on the other hand, that's just, how do we resume doing business? Or this is why people call it continuity. How do we continue doing business? So the disaster occurred, we're not at 100%, but how can we at least get by so that the company is still operational in spite of having lost a lot of resources? And here's where things start to get really challenging, because in order to just continue business, we don't need to be at 100%. Companies usually have a lot of systems that could go offline, could fail, and you do just fine, right? And I'm thinking, like, here at IT Pro TV, right? We use a number of different systems for our email and communications like that. We have our website, the video stream, like what this webinar is powered by. Internally, we use Microsoft Outlook for email and Slack for collaboration. And I'm already thinking here, like, what's a critical system and what's not? Slack is easy, because if Slack went down today, I probably wouldn't even notice. I don't know. Hey, Mike, would you consider that a critical part?
No, I don't think so. I'm okay if it's gone forever.
Yeah, I'd suffer as much as if, like, the Giphy keyboard service went down. So you have to have an idea of what's critical for your business, right? Target had an outage the other weekend. All the cash registers through the entire organization, all across the country, were unable to process any kind of electronic payments, debit card, credit card, and so on. Most people don't carry checkbooks anymore. A lot of people don't carry cash anymore. And that meant their sales went to next to nothing for a period of about 2 to 3 hours, right? That's a disaster.
I'm going to say that's very critical.
It's not a hurricane, but it is a disaster because they lost a lot of money. Now, they recovered from it and they got back to business, but you need to have some kind of plan B. What do I do if all this stuff goes down? And they didn't really have a plan B. And part of that is, it sounds like, oh, they didn't plan for it, but times have changed. It used to be, and I'm sure you remember, Mike, some of our younger viewers might not, that credit card payment terminals used to go down all the time.
Yep.
And what would happen, Mike, when you were at the cash register and they couldn't swipe the card?
You'd have to pay for cash. You go to the ATM, try to get some money, and do something like that.
Did you ever have them break out one of the impression machines?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, carbon paper and
Yeah.
Well, a lot of credit cards these days don't even have numbers embossed on them. It's like engraved, so you can't swipe them on carbon paper. And they have pin and chip technology. Well, here in the U.S., just chip, because we make bad decisions. But in other countries, pin and chip. And so you can't process the transaction without the chip being present. So they couldn't do that. That old plan B was gone. So what do? You do what Mike said. You just switch to saying, sorry, guys, we're cash only. And by the way, the ATM machine's down.
Exactly.
So if you bring your own cash, great. Otherwise, you're out of luck. Well, in order to keep going, what you've got to do, one of the first things your organization needs to do is prioritize your services, okay? And the best way to do that is through what's called a business impact analysis, a BIA. Now, performing a BIA, it can be a nightmare, but it doesn't have to be, right? In the United States, we have FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency. Oh shoot, I forgot what FEMA stands for. Maybe you can look it up like that. So FEMA's out there, and what they do is they handle the emergency response. When there's a disaster at the national level or at a state level, they send funds and organizations out there to take care of them. After some of the larger hurricanes in the last decade, FEMA has stepped up what they do here in the United States to offer more services to companies to be prepared for things like this. And they launched a website called ready.gov. And if you're a US viewer, you can take advantage of this. Your taxpayer dollars pay for it. If you are a foreign viewer, if you're in another country, you can take advantage of this too. It's not like they IP restricted and you get it free of charge. So it's a big win for you, although you have your own taxes to worry about. But one of the things they put out that I really liked was a great business impact analysis worksheet. Now, if you work for an enterprise, this is not the worksheet for you. Okay. You need to bring in auditors. You need to do a full audit of all the processes that are in your system if you haven't done one of these already. And you need to basically quantify how much it will cost per hour for a particular system to be down. Okay. And calculating that is really hard because if you think of Target with a cash register, right? There's the sales they didn't get. Well, they know their average sales per hour, so that's easy to calculate. But then you forget things like we had to pay for that cashier to stand there for an hour because who knew when the machine was going to come back on? That factors into that cost also. And then what's truly critical? What do you absolutely have? Like for IT Pro TV, technically, this whole building could shut down and we would lose our ability to go live, but all of our recorded content would still be online. So is this building critical? It really isn't, right? It would be if it was down for a long time, a period of time. So the duration of the outage would impact how significant that was. But this worksheet is designed for small, medium, even like larger organizations that are just getting started with their disaster recovery planning. And what it allows you to do is just kind of come up with an idea, a ballpark of what's a critical system. So you look at, what's the timing and duration? Like how long can you afford for something to be down? I used to work for a bank and we were FDIC insured. And the FDIC had a rule that your customers had to have access to their own funds within 72 hours.
Wow.
That you could not tell somebody they couldn't have their money for more than 72 hours. So that was a rule we had. Everything we designed, all of our redundancy was designed around the 72-hour limit. Now, if you design around a 72-hour limit, you're a fool because if you, I shouldn't say that's aggressive, but because if you come in at 72 hours and 30 minutes.
You're cutting a little too close there, aren't you?
And the FDIC will take over your bank. Like that's how it works. So you need to plan for 48 hours. And now you've got a little extra leeway to be able to cover that. If you're a hospital, 72 hours, that might not be reasonable. Can you go 72 hours without defibrillators?
Probably not.
I would assume.
You've got a lot of patients that are going to want you back up quicker than that.
You might be okay without it, but the patients might not. So, everybody's got different needs. So you got to quantify that, right? And when I say quantify, I mean you're assigning a number to it. You're trying to create something tangible. Because when you go to management, I don't know, here, Mike, let's pretend you're a manager here. And I want you to answer me honestly. And I come to you and I say, Mike, I'm trying to design our redundancy here. So what level of uptime would you like to have?
100%.
All right. Now that is a normal answer. Like any good manager.
Why would I
CEO,
want any downtime?
Exactly. Yeah. And if I say, okay, I'm going to strive for 100%, I'm setting myself up for failure and I'm setting Mike up for disappointment because it's not possible. First off, I guess there's that. Right? Let's take that into account. But secondly, 100% availability is really, really expensive. It may not be worth it. Right? How much money did Target lose when the registers were down for 2 hours? Let's say it's $1 billion, right? That sounds like a lot of money. I don't think that's how much it was, but let's pretend. For them to have full redundancy, they would have to have like a completely separate set of data lines, a separate set of payment processing, cash registers, like full redundancy, this entire environment, duplicate stores in every location. It would be way more than $1 billion. It makes sense for them to say, you know what? It was better to lose $1 billion here than it was to try and prevent that in the first place. We've got to make that judgment. And you can't make that judgment on how you feel, right? I feel like that's important. I feel like it would be expensive for that loss. So you need to assign a number. But it's also what you need to take to your leadership to say, here's what it would cost us to be down, and here's how much it would cost for us to shrink that downtime or even eliminate that downtime. And that kind of a precaution is what business resumption and disaster recovery is all about. We've got to have that. So you've got to identify those critical pieces of the network. You need to think about things like if you're providing web services or remote access to a service in your data center, power to the firewalls, power to the routers, air conditioning in your data center, just the critical servers, right? The bank that I worked at, we had probably 170 servers in our main little data area, and probably 30 of them were mission critical. Now, does that mean the other servers were garbage? No, but there were development test environments. There were remote access VPN servers. There were all sorts of other servers that did things that were important to us, but weren't critical to providing that customer service. So you've got to identify that. And if you've never checked it out, for everybody in the U.S. and outside, check out ready.gov. They have a ton of resources. Actually, most of what I'm going to talk about in this presentation you can at least get your start on ready.gov. If you want to go further, though, like enterprises really need to have a well thought out disaster recovery plan. And that's where you've got to do a lot more. Mike, you did a show with Rob Carson here on all of that.
Uh-huh.
And that's what he does for a living. He goes out and helps people draft up these plans. And did you get a chance to see one of his plans?
Yeah, we did one live, actually. He had one of his coworkers call in and do some work with us.
And for those, a lot of what he did was under NDA, so he couldn't actually show it on camera. But they can be hundreds, even thousands of pages. The ones that we had over in the bank were, I mean, they were thick stacks of books because they were planning for things like, what if every employee is dead? It's super negative, but
Right.
it's a reality. It's very possible. Our building was not earthquake rated, and there's earthquakes on the West Coast. So that was a big problem. So if we lose our entire home office, that means we lose our home office employees. So we had to have a book that was detailed enough that it could be given to contractors to be able to step in and take over that role and get everything up and operational again. So a BIA is really important. All right. So that's how we're going to start designing our redundancy and our other efforts to kind of insulate and protect and get the organization up and running. The next thing we need to work on is what's called an incident response team. Now, you probably already have an incident response team. Most organizations will have one even outside of IT for things like employee injury, right? OSHA here in the United States has requirements for this. The managers and executives are all trained to be able to respond to these types of incidents. Things like criminal activity. We just need to add IT onto that, right? And say when there's an incident, and that incident might be an incoming hurricane, an earthquake, a riot, ransomware, okay? From the moment of detection, what do we do, right? Well, your average rank and file employee might know what they do in their position, but they don't know what to do for the whole company. And so the first thing they need to do is know who to notify, who to reach out to. And they're going to be reaching out to that incident response team, the people that are responsible for making sure that you know what to do. So, for example, the University of Michigan, right? They have a building incident response team. And so for every physical building on their campus, they've got a representative that's a part of this team. And then all together, they form the incident response team for the whole campus. And so if anything happens, you notify the incident responder for that building. That incident responder then notifies the rest of the team, and then they go and they take action. And here it's built up of volunteers, right? And that makes a lot of sense for a university because you don't necessarily know what staff is in what building at what time. In an enterprise, a small business, medium business, you don't normally take volunteers on this. It's usually people that have been selected particularly for that role. It's part of their job, right? So different organizations are going to handle that different ways. But the incident response team, they're the people that have the whole plan. They know what's going to be happening at each stage of the recovery and dealing with the disaster. So you need to have those people that are in the know. The rest of the company, they need to know what to do for their job role, for their particular response. So that cashier at Target, he or she needs to know, what do I do if I can't process credit cards? But he or she doesn't need to know, how do I go get the connection back to the servers back online, right? That goes over to the IT department. And then the managers, the people at the returns desk, the people, each leg along the journey, they know their individual responsibilities. The incident response team are the ones who activate all of that, who tell everybody, okay, hey, it's time to just take cash transactions, or it's time to just shut the registers down, escort the customers out of the building and lock the doors. Somebody's got to make that decision. And the incident response team is who does that. Now, defining the incident response team is not just a matter of picking a couple of people. It's also identifying how many of them have to be present to make a decision. Do not count on having 100% of that team available because on any given day, you might have an employee calling sick. That's a normal day. Imagine if there's a disaster, right? Here, I've had it happen where it was me that was affected, where there was a hurricane, it blew through, and this was when I was working at an insurance company. So, I mean, we totally planned for a hurricane. We're an insurance company. But the hurricane blew through, and what I didn't plan on was a massive tree had blocked the main road between my house and the headquarters. I couldn't get to headquarters. There was actually no road that I could take to get around this in the weather that was there. I couldn't get to the building. And so I was effectively out of pocket for at least the initial part of that disaster until the police or the fire people had cleared the tree out. And then I was able to get over there. So there was a good 6-hour part of that window where I was not able to respond. And we updated the disaster plan after that to say, when a hurricane is coming, you sleep at the building. So
Oh, really?
the people who were on the incident response team had to go to the building because it was that building was everything Ray did. It was amazing. And so you would go in there and you would just stay at the building. And if the hurricane blew over and it was no big deal, it didn't matter. If it was a big thing, you were already there. And so that's all a part of creating that incident response team. All right, now the incident response team, they're going to assemble and they're going to start making decisions. And your plan should be dictating what those decisions are, how we decide it's time to make a certain cut. All right, I'm going to talk in a few minutes about redundancy. You might have a disaster recovery center, like a second data center, an alternate location. Well, those are awesome. And if you've planned them out really, really well, that's great. And you can flip over to them and now you're running remotely, right? But if any of you out there have ever done this, flipping over to a disaster recovery center is usually pretty smooth. It's flipping back that becomes the nightmare. So you don't want to flip over unless you absolutely have to. So there's usually some kind of criteria you define. Like if we go offline and the outage looks like it's going to be more than 6 hours, then we flip over. But if we think the outage is less than 6 hours, let's just wait. Right? Let's wait and avoid all the risk and complexity of flipping over to a whole separate data center and then having to flip back at a later date if you can avoid that. So you have to have an acceptable tolerance, and somebody's making that decision. Now, you might just say, I'll let the CEO do it. That's their job, right? They're the chief executive. But what if they're not there? What if they're not reachable? A lot of times CEOs are brilliant business people. They don't know IT. They trust the CIO to do that. And so maybe the CIO makes that decision. But again, don't necessarily know if they're going to be out of pocket or not. So we've got to keep that kind of in our plan. After the incident response team activates, though, their next thing is to reach out to everyone else involved. And it's easy to just think of your own employees here, but this is actually bigger. So I worked in an environment where we had, it was an organization that had about 100 branches, and we used frame relay between our home office and every branch. And if there was ever a disaster significant enough to take the home office offline, what we would do is we would contact our service provider. It was all done, I believe it was AT&T at the time. And so we would just reach out to them and say, hey, can you change all the frame relay? They have these permanent virtual circuits, or PVCs. Can you take all the PVCs and point them over to this other location? And it would just automatically flip. Everybody, I say automatic. We had to call, so it wasn't totally automatic. And we had to flip over to that other site, and now all the branches were back online again. Okay. Now, the reason we made it where we had to call, where it wasn't automatic, was we had a decision process. We had to decide whether or not it was appropriate to make that cutover. And if there was a scenario where we were all incapacitated and there was nobody to make that decision, we actually had an outside organization that tracked all of that, and they could make that decision too. If they realized that no one on the incident response team was available, that they could initiate that cutover too. So it was all part of the contracts. If you anticipate that stuff, it's pretty easy to build plans around this, right? What happens is people don't anticipate it. They don't think about some of the outliers. Let's say, for example, you have your own data center and you've got racks of servers, and you know you've got insurance, right? So it's all insured, and a big storm blows through, or an earthquake or something, and those servers get destroyed, right? Well, your insurance has you covered. Great, I don't have to pay for the servers. But it might take days for an adjuster to get out there. They do an evaluation, they total up a value, they cut a check, days go by. Well, even if they had instantly set a check right in your hand and said, here you go, here's $1 million, you're going to call up HP or Dell or whoever it is that you buy servers through, and you're going to place an order. And even if they have all those servers in stock right then, right ready to push onto a UPS truck, it's still going to take a day or two to get to you. And so all of that is a delay. And so you've got to anticipate those things as well. Having a huge delay in recovery like that might be a problem. And that's why disaster recovery takes a long time. Business resumption is fast. Your mission critical stuff, that needs to be fast. Have your plan, have extra servers on hand, have these things in place. But disaster recovery, it's okay to wait for the insurance check, to do the order, take the extra week or whatever. That kind of stuff is all a part of it. Now, the incident response team, they're going to be notifying these vendors. They're going to be notifying employees and saying, it's time to put this in action, right? And this is the time to follow the plan that you've already got. Hopefully, you've already got a plan. And actually, I'm going to do a little plug here. if you don't have a plan at all and a disaster hits, we're actually going to do a follow-up webinar in a few weeks on last-minute disaster recovery, which is certainly what you want to avoid. So this webinar is all about avoiding that, right? You want to have a plan. You want people to know, like, oh man, things are really bad. Let me check the book and see what it says to do. And they know what their responsibilities are. They're not having to figure it out on the fly. All right, and one thing I do want to really stress, and you'd think this would be common sense, is that if you are designing a disaster recovery solution for your organization, you need to pay attention to your backup solution. You need to design a robust backup solution. And there are so many organizations that neglect this area that it is tragic. And we're seeing this right now with the ransomware attacks, right? Ransomware encrypts your machine, locks you out of it. You can't get at your data, and your machine's effectively useless. Now, you might say, wait a minute, just restore backup, right? Restore backup, you're fine. And what we're seeing is time and time again, cities, schools, hospitals, private companies, they're paying the ransom because they find out that their backup wasn't able to survive that type of attack, right? What are some of the things that can destroy a backup? Well, let's say that I'm doing backups, and maybe I buy a state-of-the-art backup appliance, okay? For example, I used to work with tape robots from a company called Cybernetics. So they actually create really great tape equipment. But over the years, they've transitioned. And instead of physical tapes, now they do mostly virtual tapes. This is an advertisement for their virtual tape library, right? Now, virtual tapes are really cool because they use hard drives. They're fast. Some of them use SSD. They're like super fast. And if you've ever backed up to DLT or LTO tapes, they're slow. They hold terabytes of data, which is awesome, but they're slow. All right. With hard drives, they're fast. The challenge with solutions like these is that a lot of them are always online. They're online and they're on the network. And as ransomware starts to infect and encrypt machines, it sees these tape libraries online. And if they show up as hard drives, as they show up as accessible storage like that, they'll encrypt them as well. Now, companies like Cybernetics, they actually have taken steps to make it where their tapes show up as real tapes. In other words, they show up as being ejected, and you have to load the tape, and the ransomware doesn't know how to do that, and that protects them. So maybe your solution has that. You should definitely check to make sure because you don't want to be caught without. And that's what's happened to a couple of cities right here in Florida recently where they had backup solutions. They were backing up to online servers right there in their data center. And when the ransomware hit, their workstations were encrypted, their servers were encrypted, and their online backups were encrypted. And so they had no backups and no choice but to pay that ransomware. And that's a big deal. Also, if all of your backups are in one location and a fire breaks out, an earthquake, a riot, you lose your servers and you lose your backups, right? Offsite backups are super important. Now, in the old days, I say the old days, like 10 years ago, not that long ago, we would back up to tape and we would do a tape rotation where tapes were sent offsite. And so if there was a disaster, we might lose our building, but we can go to the offsite location and retrieve our tapes and then go somewhere else and restore them. Having that offsite backup was really important. It was a pain. We used to use a company called Iron Mountain, and they would come and pick up tapes and tote them out for us, and it was kind of cool. But it was a process, and if we needed to recover the tapes, it always took a long time. So that wasn't really ideal. We wanted to switch to online backups. The challenge is when you deal with tape. So like I've got an example here. B&L Associates, they do a lot of different work with tape. And they're indicating here how tape is still the best backup method, right? And that's because it's easy to ship off site. But see this container? It's all super padded. And that's because tapes are actually really sensitive. They're sensitive to magnetic interference and EMF. They're sensitive that their coil has to be under tension. And if that breaks, it really becomes hard to read. So they're pretty sensitive and they can be a little bit expensive. There are ways to do online backups that are totally safe, leveraging things like AWS, right? Amazon's Web Services, Microsoft Azure, even Google Cloud, although theirs is a little less mature, have backup solutions where you can back up to repos up there that are write once and then they can't be changed. Like ransomware can't encrypt them. The data gets stored there. Amazon actually has Glacier storage where you can throw it up there and it is super cheap. It's slow to retrieve, but it's no different than a tape. It's actually about the same speed as a tape. This type of a solution not only gives you offsite backups, but it gives you backups that can't be encrypted by ransomware. And worst case scenario, if your building was destroyed, you could log into AWS and start spinning up virtual machines, right? Or instances. You can launch those instances and restore the backup right from inside of AWS into those instances. That's the fastest type of restore that you can do, and be back online as if you had a whole new data center. But imagine, so Mike, if I gave this to you as a job, I said, hey, Mike, I got 50 servers. They're all destroyed. Right. They're all backed up into AWS. Here's my credentials. Can you bring those 50 servers up?
Yeah, give me some time and maybe.
So
right?
if you don't even know like what the operating systems are, what the servers do, which ones are critical, like if it's a Windows environment, you need that Active Directory server up first before you try and bring an Exchange server up. That order, that process, super important, right? So again, we have to have this documented, we have to have it planned, and we have to have tested that plan on at least one occasion, prior to a disaster. But you typically want to test routinely throughout the year, as well as monitoring it. How do you know the backup succeeded last night? So what I used to do when I would come to work is the very first thing I would do is check the backup status. Did the backups run? Because if they didn't, I would start a job right then, right? And I need to find out why. But the longer you wait between those backups, the more susceptible you are to having backups that don't work. And that's absolutely not what you want. All right, the last thing that I want to talk about is redundancy, right? Redundancy is a great thing. It's nice when your environment goes offline, the customer doesn't notice because some redundant piece kicks in, right? So if I have a stroke right now and drop onto the ground, I've got redundant Mike right here. He can jump in and start talking about redundancy. You know a thing or two about redundancy.
A little bit. Hot and cold sites, right? I can throw out the terms. Yeah.
There we go, right? So that's redundancy. It's a good thing. But if our internet connection goes down or something like that, and we've only got one line, then the whole stream drops, right? So we need to design redundancy. And the challenge here is that redundancy done right doubles your cost for everything, right? Mm-hmm. So just take whatever your current budget is and double it. And most companies aren't willing to do that. So it goes back to that business impact analysis, that BIA. Find your critical systems. Your critical systems build redundancy for them, right? And when we do that, we mean have another location. Have the hot, warm, or cold site that Mike mentioned. When you have a remote location, there's a lot of decisions we have to make with it. First off, it's like, where does that remote location go? Because, if it's right next door, whatever disaster hits me is probably going to hit that building next door too. So it's got to be in an appropriate location that completely avoids whatever the risk is we're trying to mitigate, right? But the other things we have to think about are, do we want it to be running and online with an exact mirror of production so we can flip over at a second's notice? That's called a hot site. That's expensive. Might be worth it though, but it is expensive. Or maybe we do a warm site. A warm site is where the critical servers are there and they're up and running and ready to go. And then other servers are just on backup tape and they're just waiting for us to get in there and kind of restore and start to bring them online. And a cold site is where I might have hardware there, I have backups there, but no up and running servers. And if there's a failure, the idea is that we drive, fly, swim, kayak, whatever, over to where the other site is, and we start the restore process, and we start bringing things back online. The equipment's called cold because it's powered off. It's just sitting there. Now, cold sites are probably the riskiest because there's a lot of things that can go wrong when you're doing a restore, and it takes time. And it's hard to test a cold site because everything's turned off. So you've actually got to go out there and do the whole test. Warm sites are easier to test because you can fail over your critical stuff just to see if it works and then fail back. And you can do it whenever you want because those are on. And then a hot site is probably the easiest because everything is over there. So you can just shut off your main building, see what happens, right? And then bring it back online. So, those are all considerations we have to have as we build this stuff out and get it kind of put into place. When you're dealing with disaster recovery for your organization, these are all things that need to be a part of your plan. Now, I talked about all of that in 35, 40 minutes, right? It sounds kind of simple. And your first pass should be simple. Your initial disaster recovery plan should just be a couple of pages as you identify what are the main things and what you're going to do. And then over time, you evolve it. You grow that. It's a living document as you add all these things that help make your company more and more robust. And by the time a year or two has gone by, your disaster recovery plan becomes a disaster recovery book. And then, it grows from there as you plan for every contingency. start with your greatest risk. Here in Florida, our greatest risk, honestly, for us, it's not even really hurricanes, because hurricanes happen once every handful of years, depending on what city you're in. They're just not that common. So for us, an internet outage is more common than a hurricane, right? A car runs into a telephone pole. That happens.
Power failures or ransomware lately.
Ransomware,
risk
yeah.
for us.
Yep. So that's those are things that we might want to plan for even before the major stuff, right? But you've always got to make sure that your data is safe and that your customers' data is protected even during a disaster. But the most important asset that I want to remind everyone to plan for are your employees, right? Data, you can get new data. Hardware, you can get new hardware. Employees, I guess you can get new employees, right? But they're not the same people, right? You need to take care of your team and yourself, right? You need to make sure you've planned for the safety of your employees first, and then move on to dealing with the rest of it. So it's all very, very important. And for the example that I'll use, the New York Stock Exchange, during the 9/11 attacks, when the Twin Towers were destroyed, they had a primary data center in the Twin Towers that was destroyed. They went offline for 2 days. For 2 days, they shut down, right? Voluntarily. They were actually down for 2 seconds. They had a redundant data center in New Jersey. And when the two towers were destroyed, the Twin Towers, sorry, not Lord of the Rings, they flipped over to New Jersey and they were back online. It was just a little blip on the network. But it was such a significant event for all of the people involved that they did the right thing. And they said, we don't need people coming to work. We don't need people trying to work around this. We need people taking care of their families. And so they shut down for 2 days. Those are important decisions to make. And that's really the responsibility of the incident response team and the leadership of a company. You got to have leadership participation in all of this. All right, well, that is a pretty good rundown on designing for redundancy. And what I want to do is kind of open the floor for some questions, a little Q&A. I know there's been a lot of activity in the chat room. So, Mike, do we have any good ones?
We do, Don. Let's start with one from Walter out in Concord, North Carolina, home of NASCAR, by the way.
Okay.
He wants to know, are there guidelines if everything is in the cloud instead of the office?
Sure. Yeah. With the cloud, you need to think of it just like any other data center. The only difference is somebody else to take care of a lot of the work, right? I don't have to plan for a generator because I know that Amazon or Google or Microsoft has already put a generator in place. I don't have to plan for a redundant power grid because they've already done that. If I'm picking a disaster recovery site and I decide I want it to be in Ireland, I don't have to build one. I just deploy stuff to the Ireland data center, right? Because they have to have one as their tax haven. So we just leverage that. So the cloud makes this stuff super easy, right? But we still have to plan for it. It's the same guidelines we have for anything else. The main thing you want to worry about, though, is regulatory compliance, right? So if you are a financial institution, you might have SAS 70, or SAS 70 has a new number, I forget, AES something, or SAE, well, whatever, whatever our standard, medical, I'll use that, that's easier, HIPAA, right? So if you have HIPAA compliance, that's going to apply if it's your data center, and it's going to apply even more so if it's a cloud location. So you've got to make sure those other locations meet their needs. After that, though, assuming you can meet your compliance requirements, then you treat it just like any other design. You treat it as if it's your data center because it effectively is, right? The only difference is that you will not be able to get employees into that data center. That will not be possible, right? So you've got to design some other kind of network operations center or something that you'll have where people can be able to reach in there and manage that. NIST actually has some documents that are out on this, as well as, actually, I don't think there's anything on ready.gov that covers the cloud. But each of the cloud providers have things. Microsoft with their Azure Recovery, they actually have some great documentation in there that you can check out.
All right, we've got another one from Steven who wants to know, I have a DR site with identical equipment to my primary site. I'm trying to get out of senior leadership what the RPO and the RTO should be, but they think having the equipment is really all they need to worry about. So what's a method I could use to explain these kind of concepts to non-technical people?
Sure. Recovery point objective and recovery time, it's recovery point and recovery time objective. Yeah. RPO and RTO, they all center around how long you can afford to be down and how much data you can afford to lose. And I usually use those exact terms. I go to leadership and I say, okay, guys, if we lose 24 hours of work, or if we lose 24 hours of cash register transactions, if we lose 24 hours of subscriptions, is that a big deal, right? How much can we afford to lose and you're okay with it, right? And what you may find is that somebody like Target says, yeah, we can be down for 2 days, no big deal. What do we care, right? Well, they probably wouldn't like that, but 2 hours, right? Let's make it a little smaller. But then you go to the stock exchange and say, you're not going to do stock trades for 2 hours? That's ridiculous. We can't do 2 minutes, right? And so that's going to set your RPO, your recovery point, like how much data you can afford to lose. But then on top of that becomes your RTO, how long before you can get back online again. So there we're saying, okay, we haven't lost data. We've captured every transaction that happened up to the disaster, but now we're not taking anything new. How long can we go without anything new coming in? And I usually just put that in terms of money. How long can we go without making money? And you'll find that some companies can actually go a long time without making money. I bet Apple could go probably a decade or two without making money. Their cash reserves are ridiculous. But if you are a nonprofit organization, you probably can't go a year without making money. You've got salaries and other things. You'll have to start letting employees go. So that's how I usually put it. Keep it simple. How much money can we afford to lose? As far as data and work previously done, and then how much time can go by before we start making money again. And if you have the exact times, like, what your current design offers, then that's great. You've got all the equipment, and that is a big deal, right? That really, really makes a significant difference. But how long is it going to take you to restore all those to current? Are you doing live syncing? Are they fully in sync right now, so your cutover is a matter of seconds? In that scenario, your RPO and RTO might be so small already that management is right. That, yeah, this is perfect. We've done enough. But if they're not in sync, if you're backing up to tape and you've got to go to Iron Mountain and it takes 6 hours to get your tapes and another 20 hours to restore, and the tapes are from yesterday, then you just lost 24 hours of data and you're going to be offline for another 24 hours while you restore. That's 48 hours of loss, right? And usually you can assign a dollar value to that, and that's what leadership responds to.
Very good. All right, I got one from Justin who wants to know, what is the best way to approach this as a sysadmin for a startup?
All right, startups. Let me tell you. So IT Pro TV was a startup for several years, and what I do, what I did here, right? When we started this network, Mike, you were there for most of it. You remember all this. Yep. I made a rule. My rule was actually pretty simple. I said, there'll be no servers in this building. I said, as a startup, we didn't have a lot of money, right? We weren't like Silicon Valley funded, so we were bootstrapped, still are. And so that meant we had to pay for what we did. And I didn't want to pay for a generator. I didn't want to pay for multiple power grids connecting. And we're in Gainesville, Florida. This stuff is not normal here. We have a monopolistic electrical grid and things like that. So for us, it was saying, how can we plan around that? And I didn't want to keep servers here if I could avoid it. I didn't want to have a high-speed internet connection here and all of these things if they weren't actually critical. So we deployed to the cloud. We said, you know what, let's take advantage of AWS, because there we can spin up an East Coast and a West Coast data center and we can have it done in 10 minutes. And we didn't have to pay for infrastructure. So taking advantage of cloud resources is something that a startup can do really easy. An enterprise that's been in business for 60 years, it's hard because you already got a data center. You have a lot of employees who are entrenched in a certain way of doing things, and they're going to be resistant to making that cloud jump, right? So that's one thing where you can kind of start with, are those cloud resources. Now, the challenge with cloud resources is hard to estimate how much they're going to cost you. And for a startup, if you are pinching pennies, having an uncertain bill is not a great thing. So you've got to kind of stay on top of that. But you need to look at everything that's being deployed in your infrastructure and say, either one, how can I make it redundant and stable without making a giant cost? Or two, how can I outsource this to let somebody else deal with the burden? And when I say outsource, I don't mean like, let's hire a bunch of employees from a impoverished nation and have them run it. What I mean is, if it's too hard to set up a redundant email server, for $6 a month, you can get a user an Office 365 account and let Microsoft worry about the redundant email server. For $5 a month, you can get a G Suite account for each user. And now you let Google worry about the email redundancy. So that's a scenario where it's technically it is outsourcing, but you're just saying, I'm going to risk transfers. I'm going to transfer that risk over to this other company and let them sort it out. And that's what a lot of startups do. Netflix started out using all AWS infrastructure, and I think they still use a lot of it, but they've shifted some off to their own. Dropbox, actually, if you Google around for Dropbox, all of Dropbox's storage was in AWS for years. And they finally reached the point where they had made enough money. Well, they had taken enough investment. They hadn't actually made enough money. And they decided they needed to turn profitable, and they built their own data centers at that point, because then they had the millions and billions of dollars to do it. So that's the way that I always recommend you approach it as a startup, is transfer any risk you can. And then as you generate money, as you generate revenue, you can start bringing it back in-house if that's your desire, or you might choose to just leave it out there with the other providers.
All right, very good, Don. Thanks for that. And another question, Mark would like to know, do you know of any software tools or techniques that will leave backup storage in an offline status until it's accessed?
So, those virtual tape libraries, that's effectively what a lot of them do. And there's ones that are physical appliances like the cybernetics ones that I brought up earlier, but even like Semantic Backup Exec, it can back up to storage. And when it does, it can flag those tapes as offline and things. They actually have it now where it can tie into a SAN and it creates LUNs, or the little slices of the storage, and it can mount and unmount those. And so they're unmounted most of the time. And that way, when you go, like if ransomware were to hit, it wouldn't even see that storage. But in Semantic Backup Exec, if we need to do a restore, it would go and mount it and bring it online. I've also seen people where they take that storage and they direct attach it to the back of a box, but still via a storage area network, just like with crossover cables on the HBA. Crossover fiber. And so by hooking it up that way, you can create kind of an isolated network that's not accessible to any other machine. So workstations can't hit it. The server itself would have to get infected. And that's what is happening in a lot of these scenarios. Is most of the time the ransomware doesn't work on our servers, right? But if I've shared that storage out on the network, workstations can access that storage directly. So it doesn't matter what operating system the server is running, they can start encrypting the payload or the data that's on that storage appliance. And that's what happens with network time machine servers and Macs, where a Mac gets hit with ransomware and the network time machine servers just start getting hit and you end up with a lost backup. So look at a number of the providers out there. I know for a fact that ArcServe and Semantic both have that functionality for on-site storage. Cybernetics does it through hardware. If you're using cloud storage like S3, they have the storage gateway. And the storage gateway lets you set that media up where you can connect to it and have it where it is either offline until you need it, like Glacier is, or where it's online, but it's write once. So you can only write to it a single time. And they call that, it's immutable storage, but they have a different name because it's admissible in court, which is good for, if you have to do e-discovery and stuff too. It's Storage Vault, or it's got a name. I can't remember the code secret name for it or whatever, but it's part of their storage gateway service.
All right, Don. Well, thanks for that. And don't worry, if we didn't get to your question, we'll answer it on Twitter with the hashtag ProsKnow. I also want to take a second to let you know about a special offer we've got for you here from IT Pro TV. If you enter the code webinar30, you're going to get 30% off of the lifetime of your subscription. And we've got plans for everybody. If it's personal for you, we've got several plans to choose from. If you're a business, take advantage of that. You can sign up your team. We've got ways to manage that team. We've got the Pro Portal that you can use to view your employees' progress and do assignments. So make sure you check that out. Other than that, Don, I think we appreciate everything you did. Great show.
Yeah, and let me just remind everybody that this was all of our long-term planning discussion, right? So things you should be doing right now while things are nice and calm, right? Encouraging your leadership to participate in. But we know the world is not a perfect place, right? So keep an eye on our webinars page, because we're going to do a follow-up webinar on last-minute planning. Like, the disaster's coming, you're not prepared in every area. What are some of the just last-ditch effort type things you can do? So be sure to tune in for that webinar also.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for watching. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Mike Roderick.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us today. You will receive a link to a recording of the webinar delivered to your inbox. All the questions we didn't get to will be answered via Twitter at #ProsKnow. Remember, that coupon code is webinar30. See you back here for the next IT Pro TV webinar.